At the end of World War II, the Korean Peninsula had been administratively divided between the Soviet Union and the United States at the 38th parallel. The idea was the Soviets would surrender the Japanese troops in the northern part of the peninsula, the Americans would do the same in the southern part of the peninsula. However, the 38th parallel soon hardened into an international divide. And on June 25th of 1950, North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, invaded the Republic of Korea, South Korea. Both of these countries had been created in 1948. And that started the Korean War. The Korean War is very much a watershed in some ways, mainly because it's the first United Nations war. Immediately after the war starts, a couple days after the war starts, the United Nations Security Council meets, votes to help the Republic of Korea, and asks its members to contribute forces under the overall command of an American officer. U.S. President Harry Truman designates Douglas MacArthur in Tokyo as that officer and creates UN Command. And on July 14, 1950, MacArthur raises the UN flag, similar to this, a larger version, atop his headquarters building at the Daiichi building. This is the first UN war. This is the first UN real mission for the Security Council, and makes it something of a watershed. By the time the Korean War is over in 1953, or the Korean War Armistice is signed in 1953, troops from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Turkey, France, the Netherlands, Greece, Belgium, the Philippines, for the first time as an independent nation, Thailand, Colombia, Ethiopia, South Africa, Luxembourg, Italy, Denmark, India, Norway, and Sweden have all contributed units, either combat units or medical units, to the United Nations Command. Today, South Korea, if you count the nations that rebuild it, South Korea holds the record for number of nations that have helped both sustain its independence but also rebuild it after the war. And the Korean people, every year, as a matter of fact, out here at MacArthur Square, do a display of flags saying thank you for what has been done. But the Korean people, one of the things that needs to be noted is that the Korean people could have chosen, the South Koreans could have knuckled under when the North Koreans attacked. But instead they chose to fight. And the Americans, under the leadership of General MacArthur and under the auspices of the UN Security Council, committed themselves to the defense of Korea. For reasons that we will see, that commitment remains in fact intact to this day. So we've set up the Korean War. Let's come on over here and talk a little bit about the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, June 25th, 1950 to July 27th, 1953. The 38th parallel runs right here. For those of you who are viewing in the United States, Charlottesville, Virginia sits just north of the 38th parallel, and Interstate 64 in Kentucky runs along the 38th parallel. So just to give you an idea of how this fits in geographically on a map of the United States. The North Koreans attack southward. Here's the South Korean capital of Seoul. Here's the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. China is here. Japan is just barely on the map right here. They attack southward and very quickly push the South Koreans with American reinforcements into what is known as the Pusan Perimeter, an area right here 100 miles long and 50 miles wide. They control 85% of the Korean peninsula by August of 1950, just 6 weeks after the war starts. But in one of the great defensive stands in the history of the United States Army, the U.S. 8th Army under Walton Walker, assisted by the South Koreans, hold off all North Korean attacks and hold the Pusan Perimeter, August 1st to September 15th, 1950. Some incredibly desperate fighting. In a couple of cases, they're down to their last reserves that throw back the last North Korean attacks. It's absolutely incredible stand by the Americans and the Koreans. Meanwhile, Douglas MacArthur has some reinforcements coming from the United States. He has some troops in Japan. He's trying to figure out what to do. He could feed them into Pusan, but he's planning on a counterstrike. And he looks at the map and he realizes if he lands at the port of Incheon, he just has to advance a little bit to Seoul, cut the North Korean supply line to this area, and he'll have a good chance to destroy the North Korean army. The problem is Incheon has some of the highest tides in the world. It can only be landed on a couple of days a month, and the next day coming up is September 15th. Joint Chiefs of Staff, the War Department back in Washington are convinced this is not a good idea, but MacArthur says the fact that the North Koreans would not expect it, this is a crazy place to land because of the tides, means it's a great idea. And he pushes it through. And so the 1st Marine Division and the U.S. 7th Division land here September 15th, 1950. They retake Seoul 2 weeks later. Meanwhile, there's a breakout from the Pusan perimeter, and they destroy the bulk of the North Korean army right here. Push back to the 38th parallel by October 1st. At this point, the UN Security Council, which had said, liberate South Korea, passes a new resolution. If you can, unify the Korean Peninsula. And so MacArthur, as he had said, feel unfettered is the guidance he got, push north into North Korea. China, which had gone communist just the year before, sends and doesn't have relations with the United States, doesn't have diplomatic relations with a lot of countries in the UN command, sends a notice through India, if you approach the Yalu River, we will be forced to act. Those are discounted. MacArthur meets with Truman at Wake Island, October 15th, 1950, discounts warnings of Chinese intervention. Continue to push north, take Pyongyang, the 8th Army in this area, U.S. 10th Corps operating in this area over here. They find some Chinese volunteers. MacArthur discounts them, launches an attack to be home by Christmas, right before Thanksgiving 1950. At this point, 300,000 Chinese attack. The U.S. 8th Army fights a very desperate battle in this area here on the Chongcheng River. Meanwhile, U.S. Marines here at the Chosin Reservoir are surrounded by the Chinese and begin to fight their way the 60 miles down to Hungnam on the coast. As one of the Marines said, it's not retreat, it's attack in another direction, as they fought their way through the mountains back. The U.S. 7th Division, which had actually reached the Yalu River here at Hyesanjin, turn around, retreat back to Hungnam as well, and in the American Dunkirk, 105,000 Americans and Koreans pull out December 12th through 24th, 1950. This is an important moment in Korean history because there are 100,000 Korean refugees that have lived in the north and don't want to stay, and they show up in the port and there are no orders about what to do with them. The commander here, a man named Edward Almond, who was a controversial figure, but I have to say this for him. Almond says, whatever spare shipping space there is, I want you to take refugees. 98,000 people get out and evacuate to Pusan. 5 children are born at sea on their way to Pusan. This has such a profound impact on the Korean psyche. They made a movie about it 2 years ago. But there are a lot of people that say this cemented our relationship with the Korean people. We weren't just there for ourselves. We were there for the Korean people. And this remains a big moment in our relationship with the Republic of Korea. But that doesn't disguise the fact that the Chinese had pushed our forces south, the U.S. forces, the UN forces south, in the longest retreat in the history of the United States Army, from the Yalu River in one place back down to the vicinity of Seoul. New Year's Eve, the Chinese launch another attack, push the UN forces south of Seoul. Matthew Ridgway takes over command of 8th Army, Walton Walker having died in a traffic accident, fights his way back north in a series of intense battles, and finally, right in basically the waist of the peninsula, has fought something of a standstill. At this point, MacArthur and Truman have been going back and forth about policy. MacArthur wants to fight it to a finish. There's no substitute for victory. But Truman realizes if we go north and get up and really go after the Chinese and start bombing China, the Soviet Union is right here. The Soviet Union has a mutual defense pact with the Chinese, and that probably means trouble in Europe and World War III. Wrong war, wrong time, wrong place, is what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Omar Bradley, says. This dispute becomes public, and on April 11th, 1951, Truman relieves MacArthur. That summer, negotiations open for an armistice. It takes them 2 years to hammer out an agreement. Battle lines don't move significantly from where they stop in the summer of 1951, and on July 27th, 1953, the armistice takes effect. There has never been a peace treaty, and technically, the two Koreas remain at war. As a matter of fact, one of the negotiating points for North Korea about their nuclear armaments is give us a peace treaty, give us diplomatic recognition, give us a peace treaty. So it remains a geopolitical issue today. And geopolitically, there hasn't been a whole lot of change since MacArthur was fired in 1951. how we handle MacArthur's firing here. On this side is MacArthur's account of the issue at hand and what happens. Behind me is Truman's account from his memoirs. This is MacArthur's memoirs, Truman's memoirs. You decide. But there is something to keep in mind. The fundamental tension is they were both right. They were also both wrong. Truman was right. Wrong war, wrong place, wrong time. Third World War was definitely avoided. But there is no substitute for victory because we're still there. It's still a tripwire. This is still the most heavily militarized border in the world. And North Korea remains a dangerous foe and an unpredictable geopolitical force in Northeast Asia, just like it was 1950, 51, 52, and 53.